I've spent a lot of time on this podcast criticizing the left, calling out their childish behavior, exposing the media machine that programs them, and documenting the logical failures of their ideology. And all of that is necessary. The truth needs to be told. But here's the practical problem. We're living with these people. They're our coworkers, our neighbors, sometimes our family members. We're stuck in the same country, dealing with the same problems, trying to build a future in the same communities. And if we can't find ways to reach at least some of them, if we can't break through the programming and get them to question what they've been taught, then we're headed toward an increasingly divided society where productive conversation becomes impossible. So, this episode is different. This isn't about calling them names or venting frustration. This is about strategy. This is about understanding how indoctrination works and figuring out practical methods to help people break free from it. I'm not going to promise you magic solutions. You're not going to convert your blue-haired cousin at Thanksgiving dinner with one perfect argument. Most people who are deeply indoctrinated won't change. They're too invested in their identity, too dependent on their tribe. They're too comfortable in their bubble. But some people are reachable. Some people are starting to question. Some people have had experiences that contradict what they've been taught, and they're looking for permission to think differently. Those are the people we can reach. And reaching them requires understanding how their minds work, what defenses they've been taught to deploy, and what strategies actually break through those defenses. This isn't about winning arguments. It's about planting seeds. It's about asking questions that make people think. It's about creating space for doubt to grow. It's about being the reasonable voice that offers an alternative when the programming finally starts to crack. Let's talk about how to actually do that.
Courage, compassion, faith, freedom, truth. Welcome to Courage in the Darkness with your host, Philip Roberts. It's time to awaken America.
Before you can help someone break free from indoctrination, you need to understand how that indoctrination works. What are the psychological mechanisms that keep people trapped in false beliefs? What defenses have been built into their worldview to protect it from challenge? First, understand that indoctrination isn't just about teaching someone incorrect information. It's about creating an entire framework for processing information that filters out anything that contradicts the approved narrative. Think of it like installing software with built-in security protocols. The software doesn't just tell you what to believe, it tells you how to evaluate new information, what sources to trust, what arguments to reject, and what questions are legitimate versus which ones are dangerous. When someone's been through years of leftist education and media consumption, they've had this software installed. They've internalized a whole system for categorizing information as either legitimate or illegitimate based on the source and whether it confirms or challenges their existing beliefs. This is why simply presenting facts doesn't work. The facts get filtered through this system and rejected before they even get seriously considered. The person doesn't think, that's interesting evidence that contradicts what I believe. They think, that's right-wing propaganda, and I can dismiss it. The programming also includes emotional associations. Certain ideas trigger fear responses. Certain questions trigger guilt or shame. This isn't accidental. It's how the indoctrination protects itself. For example, if you've been taught that questioning open borders is racist, then anytime you start to question open borders, you feel shame and guilt. That emotional response shuts down the questioning before it can go anywhere. You retreat back to the approved position to make the bad feeling go away. The programming creates an identity around the beliefs. You're not just someone who happens to hold progressive positions. You're a good person because you hold those positions. You're enlightened, compassionate, on the right side of history. This means that challenging the beliefs feels like a challenge to the person's entire sense of self. If they're wrong about immigration or taxation or whatever, that doesn't just mean they were misinformed. It means they're not a good person that they thought they were. The indoctrination also creates tribal belonging. Being progressive isn't just about beliefs. It's about being part of your community. Your friends are progressive, your social media follows are progressive, your entertainment consumption is progressive. Your entire social world is built around this identity. Questioning the beliefs means risking exclusion from that community. It means potentially losing friends, creating family conflict, being ostracized from your social circles. That's a huge psychological cost that most people won't pay unless they're pushed to it. Understanding all of this is critical because it explains why the approaches that seem logical to us don't work on indoctrinated people. You can't just present facts and expect them to change their minds. The programming filters out facts and unapproved sources. You can't just make logical arguments. The emotional associations and identity attachments override logic. You can't expect them to admit you're right, even if they secretly start to doubt. The social costs are too high. So what does work? You have to understand that you're not just presenting information. You're trying to create cracks in the programming. You're trying to introduce doubt in ways that don't trigger the defensive mechanisms. This requires a completely different approach than the one most conservatives instinctively use. We tend to want to argue, to prove we're right, to overwhelm them with facts and logic until they have to admit that we're correct. That approach fails almost every time because it triggers all the defenses. It activates the tribal loyalty. It makes the conversation about winning and losing rather than exploring truth. What works is subtler. It's asking questions instead of making statements. It's expressing curiosity instead of certainty. It's finding inconsistencies in their worldview and gently pointing them out without attacking the person. It's understanding that you're playing a long game. You're not trying to convert someone in one conversation. You're trying to plant seeds of doubt that will grow over time as they encounter more experiences that contradict their programming. Let me be clear. This approach requires patience. It requires humility. It requires being willing to have conversations where you don't win in any obvious way. You're not going to get the satisfaction of the other person admitting you were right. But what you might get is a person who 6 months or a year later starts questioning things on their own, who remembers that you asked questions they couldn't answer, who realizes that the programming didn't prepare them to defend their beliefs, only to dismiss challenges. That's success. Not dramatic conversion, but gradual awakening, not defeating them in argument, but helping them think. The single most effective tool for reaching indoctrinated people is questions, not rhetorical questions designed to make them feel stupid, not gotcha questions designed to trap them. Genuine questions asked with genuine curiosity about how they arrived at their beliefs. This is called the Socratic method, after the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, who taught by asking questions rather than lecturing. The method works because it bypasses the defensive mechanisms that get triggered when you make statements. When you make a statement, especially one that contradicts someone's beliefs, their brain immediately goes into defense mode. They start formulating counterarguments. They start looking for ways to dismiss what you're saying. They stop listening and start preparing to respond. But when you ask a question, especially if it's asked genuinely, their brain has to engage differently. They have to actually think about the answer. They have to examine their own reasoning. And sometimes in doing that, they discover that their reasoning isn't as solid as they thought. Let me give you specific examples of how this works in practice. Instead of saying, open borders would be a disaster, try asking, how do you think we should determine who gets to immigrate to America? Should there be any limits, or should anyone who wants to come be able to come? If there should be limits, what should they be based on? These questions force the person to actually think through the practical implications of their position. Most people who support open borders haven't actually thought about what that would mean in practice. They've just accepted the emotional appeal of being welcoming and inclusive. By asking them to explain the specifics, you're making them confront the complexity they've been avoiding. And often, once they start trying to answer, they don't realize their position doesn't make sense. Instead of saying, socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried, try asking, can you point me to an example of a socialist country that succeeded? What did they do differently than the ones that failed? What would prevent the same problems from happening here? This approach doesn't directly challenge their belief in socialism. It just asks them to provide evidence for it. And if they can't, if they start stumbling or making excuses or getting defensive, that's them realizing that their belief isn't based on evidence. Instead of saying, defunding the police was a terrible idea, try asking, what do you think should happen when someone commits a violent crime? Who should respond? How should they be trained and equipped? How should that be funded? Again, you're asking them to think through the practical realities. Most people who supported defunding the police never thought about what would replace police. They just liked the slogan and the emotional satisfaction of pushing an institution they'd been taught to hate. Making them articulate what the alternative would actually look like often reveals that they haven't thought it through. Here's the key to making this work. You have to ask genuine questions, not rhetorical ones. You have to actually listen to their answers and engage with what they say. You have to be willing to acknowledge when they make good points. If you're just asking questions as a setup for your real argument, they'll see through it and they'll shut down. But if you're genuinely curious about how they think, if you're trying to understand their reasoning, they'll engage. And once they're engaged, once they're actually thinking through their positions, instead of just repeating slogans, that's when the cracks start to form. Another powerful technique is to ask them to steelman the opposing position. What do you think is the strongest argument against your position? How would you respond to that? This forces them to acknowledge that there are legitimate arguments on the other side. It requires them to engage with opposing views in a serious way rather than just dismissing them. And often, when someone tries to articulate the best argument against their position, they realize it's actually pretty compelling. They realize that maybe the issue is more complicated than they thought. You can also ask questions that reveal inconsistencies in their worldview without being accusatory. But you have to do this gently. For example, if someone says they support women's rights but also defends Islam, you might ask them, how do you reconcile supporting women's equality with defending practices like mandatory hijab or the testimony rules in Sharia law? I'm genuinely curious how you think about that tension. You're not accusing them of hypocrisy. You're just pointing out that there seems to be a tension between the two things that they believe. And you're curious how they resolve it. Often, they haven't thought about this tension, and being asked to think about it plants seeds of doubt. Maybe their positions aren't as coherent as they thought. Maybe they've been holding contradictory beliefs without realizing it. The Socratic method works because it puts the burden on them to defend and explain their beliefs, rather than putting you in the position of trying to convince them of yours. It makes them do the intellectual work. And in doing that work, they often discover their beliefs are built on sand. But again, this requires patience. You're not going to see immediate results. The person might walk away from the conversation still holding their beliefs. But if you asked good questions that they couldn't answer, Those questions will stick with them. Later, when they encounter information that relates to those questions, they'll think about it differently. When they hear someone repeat the slogans they couldn't defend, they'll notice. Slowly, the programming starts to crack. This is planting seeds. You water them with questions, and over time, they might grow into doubt. And doubt is the first step toward thinking independently. One of the biggest mistakes conservatives make when trying to reach indoctrinated people is starting with the most divisive issues. We want to argue about the things we care most about, the things where we're most confident we're right. But that's exactly the wrong approach. Starting with divisive issues immediately triggers tribal defenses. It puts the person in a position where they have to choose sides, and they're going to choose their side. Instead, start with common ground. Find things you actually agree on. Build rapport and trust before you get anywhere near the contentious topics. This might seem like a waste of time, but it's actually critical. People are much more willing to consider new ideas from someone they see as reasonable and on their side than from someone they see as the enemy. What does common ground look like in practice? It depends on the person, but here are some areas where you can often find agreement even with indoctrinated leftists. Corporate corruption. Most people across the political spectrum are unhappy with the way large corporations avoid taxes, exploit workers, and use political influence to rig the game in their favor. You can agree on the problem, even if you disagree on the solution. Healthcare costs. Everyone agrees healthcare in America is too expensive. The disagreement is about what caused it and how to fix it. But you can start with shared frustration about the status quo. Education quality. Most people think schools could be doing a better job. They want kids to learn. They want education to prepare students for successful lives. You can agree on the goal even if you disagree about the methods. Government waste. Even people who support big government programs can usually agree that there's too much waste and inefficiency in how those programs are run. Finding this common ground serves multiple purposes. First, it establishes you as someone reasonable who cares about the same things that they care about. You're not a cartoon villain who just wants poor people to suffer. You're someone who sees the same problems and wants to find solutions. Second, it creates an opening to discuss why certain solutions don't work. Once you've established that you both care about healthcare costs, for example, you can have a conversation about whether government-run healthcare actually reduces cost. You can point to evidence from other countries. You can discuss trade-offs. But you're having that conversation from a foundation of shared concern, not from a position of opposing sides. Third, it sometimes reveals that you're not actually as far apart as the tribal signaling suggests. You might find that you agree on 80% of the things and only disagree on solutions or priorities for the remaining 20%. That's a much less threatening realization than we're on opposite sides of every issue. It creates space for cooperation and mutual understanding. Here's another important point. When you do find common ground, acknowledge it explicitly. I think we actually agree on this. We both want X. We both think Y is the problem. We might disagree on how to fix it, but we're starting from the same place. This reinforces that you're not enemies. You're people with shared concerns trying to figure out the best path forward. Now, this doesn't mean you avoid disagreement or pretend you agree when you don't. That's dishonest and it won't work. But it means you choose your battles and your timing carefully. When you do disagree, frame it in terms of shared values. I understand you want to help poor people. I do too. I just worry that this particular policy might actually hurt them in the long run because of X. What do you think about that concern? You're not challenging their compassion. You're not questioning their motives. You're just raising a practical concern about whether a specific policy achieves the shared goal. This is much less threatening than your solution is wrong and here's why. It invites conversation instead of shutting it down. Another aspect of finding common ground is acknowledging where conservatives have failed. We're not perfect. We haven't solved all the problems. Some Republican politicians are corrupt or ineffective. Some conservative policies haven't worked as intended. Being willing to admit this shows intellectual honesty. It shows you're not just a tribal partisan defending your side no matter what. You're someone who evaluates ideas and policies based on their merits. And when you model that kind of intellectual honesty, it creates permission for the other person to do the same. If you criticize your own side, maybe they can too. Maybe they don't have to defend every Democrat or every progressive policy. This is how you start breaking down the tribal defensiveness, not by attacking their tribe directly, but by modeling a different way of thinking that isn't purely tribal. Here's a practical example of how this might work in conversation. You're talking to a progressive coworker about crime. Instead of starting with, Democrats destroyed our cities with soft on crime policies, you start with, man, it's crazy how bad crime has gotten in some areas. I feel like something needs to change. They agree. Everyone agrees crime is bad. You've established a common ground. Then you might ask, what do you think would actually reduce crime? Like, what policies do you think work? They share their thoughts. Maybe they talk about poverty reduction, education, rehabilitation. You listen. You acknowledge good points. Yeah, I definitely think education matters. Good point. Then you might gently introduce a complication. I wonder though, like, what do we do right now about people actively committing crimes? Not prevention for the future, but like someone's breaking into cars tonight. What happens? This opens a conversation about enforcement without making it about sides. You're just asking practical questions about how society handles the immediate problem. And in that conversation, you might find opportunities to share information about what actually reduces crime. and how reducing police presence affected different neighborhoods, about the trade-offs involved in different approaches. But you're doing it from a foundation of shared concern about the problem, not from a position of my team versus your team. This is the long game, building trust, finding common ground, having real conversations instead of political arguments. It's slower, it's less satisfying than scoring points in a debate, but it's what actually works when you're trying to reach people. Here's something important that I haven't mentioned yet. Not everyone is reachable. Some people are so deeply indoctrinated, so dependent on their tribal identity, so invested in their beliefs that no amount of patient questioning or common ground will break through. And you need to be able to recognize those people and walk away. Not in anger, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet understanding that your time and energy are limited and they're better spent elsewhere. How do you recognize someone who's unreachable? Here's the signs. First, they won't engage with questions. When you ask genuine questions, they respond with slogans or accusations. They won't actually think about what you're asking. They just go back to their programming. If you ask, how should we determine who could immigrate? And they respond, why do you hate immigrants? They're not interested in thinking. They're just deploying the defensive script they've been taught. You can try once or twice with rephrasing, but if they keep avoiding actual engagement, they're telling you that they're not ready to think. Second, they personalize everything. Every policy disagreement becomes an attack on their character or identity. You can't discuss tax policy without them accusing you of not caring about poor people. You can't discuss immigration without them calling you a racist. This is a defense mechanism. They're making the conversation about your moral character rather than about the actual issues because they can't defend their positions on the merits. If someone consistently does this, they're not interested in real conversation. They're interested in performing moral superiority. Walk away. Third, they get emotional in ways that shut down conversation. Getting upset about serious issues is normal. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is people who use emotion as a weapon to make discussion impossible. They start crying or yelling or storming off the moment you question their beliefs. They make it so uncomfortable to disagree with them that people learn to just avoid doing it. This is manipulation. And you can't have productive conversations with people who manipulate the emotional environment to prevent disagreement. Fourth, they're completely immersed in the bubble. All their friends are progressives. All their media consumption is progressive. They live in a progressive city, work in a progressive industry, and have structured their entire life around progressive identity. These people have too much invested to question their beliefs. Questioning would mean potentially losing their entire social world. The psychological cost is too high. You're not going to break through that in casual conversations. They would need a major life disruption, a serious reality check that forces them to question everything. Until that happens, they're unreachable. Fifth, they're hostile and contemptuous. They don't just disagree with you, they hate you. They think you're stupid or evil or both. They have no respect for your intelligence or your values. You can't reach people who have contempt for you. The hostility creates a wall that no argument or question can penetrate. They've dehumanized you, and you can't have human connection with someone who's done that. When you recognize these signs, walk away. Not necessarily from the relationship if it's family or someone you can't avoid, but from trying to change their mind. Accept that they're where they are and you can't help them until they decide that they want help. This is important for your own mental health and effectiveness. Trying to reach unreachable people is exhausting and demoralizing. You pour time and energy into conversations that go nowhere. You get frustrated and angry, and that frustration makes you less effective when you're talking to people who actually are reachable. Save your energy for the people who might listen. The people who ask genuine questions. The people who seem uncertain or curious. The people who haven't completely locked themselves in the bubble. Those people exist. They're not the loudest voices. They're not the ones getting the most attention on social media. But they are out there, questioning quietly, looking for alternatives to the programming. Those people are worth your time. Here's how to recognize reachable people. They ask you questions instead of just lecturing you. They acknowledge when you make good points. They seem genuinely curious about different perspectives. They express frustration with their own side sometimes. These are signs that the programming isn't complete, that there's still independent thought happening, that doubt is already starting to grow. With those people, be patient, be helpful, be the reasonable voice that offers an alternative. Don't push too hard. Don't expect quick results. Just keep asking questions, finding common ground, and being available when they're ready to think differently. And be okay with the fact that most people won't change. That's not your failure. That's just reality. Indoctrination is powerful. Tribal identity is powerful. Social pressure is powerful. Most people won't overcome those forces, but some will. And if you can help even a few people break free, that's worth the effort. Also, know when you need to walk away for your own sake. If engaging with indoctrinated people is making you angry, bitter, or hopeless, take a break. You can't help others if you're burning yourself out. Focus on building your own community. Strengthen your own relationships with people who share your values. Work on local issues where you can make practical differences. Engage with the reachable people when you have the energy. But don't make it your entire existence. You're not responsible for saving everyone. You're just responsible for being faithful to truth and available to people who want to hear it. Reaching indoctrinated people isn't about winning arguments. It's about planting seeds. It's about asking questions that create doubt. It's about being the reasonable alternative when the programming starts to crack. Most people won't change. The indoctrination is too strong. The tribal identity is too important. The social cost, too high. Accept that reality and don't waste your energy trying to convert people who aren't ready. But some people are reachable. They're starting to question. They're noticing contradictions. They're having experiences that don't match what they've been taught. They're looking for permission to think differently. For those people, be patient. Use the Socratic method. Ask genuine questions instead of making statements. Find common ground before addressing disagreements. Model intellectual honesty by acknowledging when your side is wrong. And most importantly, be willing to walk away when someone isn't ready. Save your energy for the people who might actually listen. This is a long game. You're not going to see dramatic results. You're not going to convert your whole family at Thanksgiving. You're not going to flip your office from blue to red. But you might help one person start questioning. And that person might help someone else. And slowly, quietly, the programming starts to crack. That's how change happens. Not through dramatic confrontations. Not through destroying the opposition, but through offering genuine alternatives. Be that alternative. Ask the questions. Find the common ground. And trust that truth has power, even when it takes time to work. Check out Truth in the Darkness at titdusa.com for more content on reaching people with truth. We're building resources for having these conversations, for understanding the opposition, and for being effective messengers of reality in a world of propaganda. Be patient, be strategic, be faithful to truth, and I'll see you next time.